Drake? Drake?
Yes, Drake is the Falcons' number one receiver, but do the Falcons have the answers at that number 2 spot to help Desmond Ridder put his best foot forward in 2023?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. We always give love to the everydayers out there, and I love how many of you guys, ask questions and respond and give me that feedback and say, hey, I listen to the podcast every day. It's nice to know that so many of you are out there making this podcast your first listen. And so if you are not in the loyal rewards club of everydayers, then make sure you do so by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So we are continuing Locked On Desmond Ridder week, talking specifically about how the Falcons receivers can help him overcome his issues. And those issues stem from a conversation we had earlier this week with Matt Waldman about Desmond Ridder's issues, talking about his struggles to process and read leverage against man coverage. And yesterday we talked about how Desmond Ridder using his legs as a runner could help compensate for that due to defenses' tendencies that play a lot of man coverage to struggle against mobile quarterbacks. And today we're going to be talking about how the wide receiver position affects this issue. And this is basically an issue, as Matt Waldman described it, as, windows being tight, right? And if your quarterback has a problem reading leverage, as Matt Waldman alleges, that can be an issue in those tighter windows that you tend to get against man coverage. And while I said on yesterday's episode, my film study of Desmond Ridder, whether that's at Cincinnati or this first year in Atlanta, doesn't suggest to me that it's a major issue with Desmond Ridder, to the point that I don't think it's something that he can overcome. I can certainly understand that for someone like Matt Waldman, who thought that was an issue for him coming out of Cincinnati, the last 4 games of this past season, I don't think there was enough on film to dissuade you that it is no longer an issue. And of course, I have no problem deferring to Matt Waldman on this specific issue, just because I know Matt Waldman has a better eye for detail than even I have. And, anybody who's read the rookie scouting portfolio certainly would agree with that assessment. So I have no problem, giving Matt Waldman the benefit of the doubt and saying this is a legit issue for Desmond Ridder. And let's talk all week long about how he and the team can overcome these issues. And of course, we're talking about the receiver position. And Matt Waldman himself on that episode talked about how having receivers like Drake London and Kyle Pitts that can win against man coverage is valuable if this is going to be a problem for Desmond Ridder, that is going to allow him to overcome this issue. Right? Because you have these receivers that can win in contested catch situations. You have these receivers that can separate and get open. Now, another aspect that complicates our evaluation of Desmond Ridder, especially late last season when it comes to attacking the man coverage, was how much the Falcons offense was so simplified due to the absence of Kyle Pitts, right? That basically their offense often, when you would watch the film, or when I would watch the film, it was basically, is Drake London open? If yes, throw him the ball. If the answer is no, we'll figure that out. That's kind of what the offense was, right? It was a one-man show with Drake London, and basically the offense worked when Drake London was able to get open and Desmond Ridder was able to find him. And the offense didn't really work all that much outside of a handful of Michael Pruitt plays and an occasional Ferkser play, an occasional Zacchaeus play, a check down to Algier, a screen to Patterson or something like that. But, it didn't work a whole lot of those last 4 weeks. And again, there's reasons to be optimistic, largely due to the return of Kyle Pitts. We'll talk more about that probably on tomorrow's episode. But I think it led to a lot of people accusing Desmond Ridder, one of the criticisms that people had of Desmond Ridder during his first 4 starts was that he was staring down reads. I remember Alan Stirk, my good buddy and former co-host here on the Locked On Falcons, was saying similar things about Desmond Ridder last December and last January. And I personally don't think that was an issue. One, because I do think, again, you can understand why Desmond Ridder was locking. If he was staring down anybody, he was staring down Drake London, and the circumstances led to him doing that. And two, I think it's pretty common for quarterbacks to quote unquote stare down receivers based off of the film I've been watching over the last decade plus. Because if you go back and you watch Matt Ryan through the first 7 or 8 years of his NFL career, that a lot of that Falcons offense was pre-snap. Matt Ryan would identify the favorable matchup, whether that was against Roddy White, Tony Gonzalez, or Julio Jones. And then he would basically lock onto that guy, post snap, and wait for that guy to get open and throw him the football. And that was basically how the Falcons operated for the first 7 or 8 years of Matt Ryan's career, for the most part. Again, not every single snap, but for most part. And I don't think, if it wasn't an issue for a 32-year-old Matt Ryan, I don't think it should be made into a mountain made out of this molehill for a 23-year-old Desmond Ridder, because we even saw later in Matt Ryan's career that when we changed offensive coordinators and he became less comfortable and less confident in what the play calling was, especially towards the back half of his career, those became seasons where he tended to stare down Julio Jones and basically like, this is the only guy I trust to get open. I'm going to throw him the football. I'm going to wait for him to get open. And if he gets open, great. If he doesn't get open, again, going back to the point, like, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's what the Falcons offense was in 2017 and 2019 and other years. And so, again, I don't have a fault for Desmond Ridder operating that same way, in his first 4 starts when Matt Ryan was doing this, 140 starts into his NFL career or whatever the number is. But the point remains that if this does continue to be a feature of the offense, that connection that Desmond Ridder has with Drake London is certainly going to matter this year, as it did over those final 4 games. And if Ridder is still questionable, let's say, at making some of these leverage throws and man coverage, I do think having a receiver like Drake London that can win in those contested catch situations is very valuable. And we will talk about Drake London's ability and potential to be that go-to weapon in this offense in the same ways that Julio Jones and Roddy White were as Matt Ryan's security blankets. I think Drake London can be exactly the same thing for Desmond Ridder moving forward. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But why not, in the meantime, make a fast break to FanDuel for the NBA playoffs? The Western Conference Finals are over. The Eastern Conference Finals potentially maybe over, as many of you are listening to this. But, it doesn't mean that you can't continue to, put money on the playoffs over at FanDuel, where new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means you get $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. And you can bet on the NBA playoffs. You can bet on the upcoming draft. I love FanDuel's parlay builder, where you can go and figure out which player is going to give you 20 plus points or 15 plus points or 6 plus assists or 8 plus rebounds. And you can combine those bets to bet a little to win a lot in a parlay. Of course, you can bet on NFL props. You can bet on Major League Baseball. They have a parlay builder for that as well, with runs, hits, and homers, all that and more. Just so there's no better place than to hang out than at America's #1 sportsbook and FanDuel by heading to FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you'll get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we talked about, how Drake London, the offense became so Drake-centric in the final month of the season with Kyle Pitts out of the lineup. And we talked about the 4 games with Desmond Ridder, but that also included the last couple of starts of Marcus Mariota as well. We missed Kyle Pitts for the last 5 games of the season because he got hurt in the Bears game. So I guess, or maybe it's 6 games. But anyway, I did the math for the last 5 games. Sorry. I'm now realizing I probably should have done it for the last 6 games. But over the last 5 full games that Drake London had, he was targeted 52 times. The Falcons threw it 164 times. That is a target share of 31.7%. That is very high in the NFL for a single receiver to have. And you look at the 10 games, full games that London and Pitts had when they were both healthy at the beginning of the season, London's target share during that stint of games was 26.8% of the targets, right? And then you compare that target share that Drake London had to what Julio Jones had during the height of his career, his 6 peak seasons between 2014 and 2019, where his average target share was about 27.9%. So like a percentage point higher than what Drake London's was in the first part of the season. And Julio only had one season during that span of years where his target share was over 30%. That was 32.7% that he had in 2015 season, which led to the Falcons, of course, making significant moves to upgrade their wide receiver core in 2016 to give him more help. And then you compare Drake London's target share to, say, Roddy White's 6 peak seasons from 07 to 2012, where Roddy's target share across those 6 years on average was about 28.4%, so slightly higher than Julio's. And that's because there were 3 years that Roddy had where his target share was over 30%. That was 08, where it was 34.1%, 2010, where it was 31%, and 2011, where it was 30.3%. And so clearly, when you look at Drake London's usage, whether you're looking at the beginning of the year when it was both him and Pitts, or the latter half of the season, or latter, 5-6 weeks of the season, he was getting a workload comparable to a wide receiver one, not too dissimilar to Julio Jones or Roddy White. And I think when we compare Drake London, he probably compares more favorably in terms of how he plays and how he wins to a Roddy White, more of a big physical possession receiver that can make plays down the field, but isn't necessarily, putting the fear of God in defensive coordinators with his ability to stretch defenses. You're not necessarily bracketing him every single snap like teams did with Julio Jones during the peak of his powers, although Roddy did get his fair share of brackets moving forward. And obviously, the more that the Falcons offense relies on Drake London moving forward, you will see him get more and more bracketed over time as defenses make that adjustment. But I think you can look at the obvious parallels between the current Falcons offense that has Drake London at wide receiver, Kyle Pitts at tight end, the run game that the Falcons are constructing, and have the parallels between the early Matt Ryan years where it was Roddy White at receiver, Tony Gonzalez at tight end in those 09 and 2010 seasons, and Michael Turner was kind of spearheading that ground attack. And so, you can see how it can work for the Falcons with Drake London basically being the new version of Roddy White. Now, when it comes to Drake London winning against man coverage, which is, the core of, what we've been talking about as we've been locked on Desmond Ridder all week long, Drake London was very good last year when it came to beating man coverage, at least according to Matt Harmon in his reception perception, who indicated based off of his charting that Drake London had a 72.3% success rate against man coverage last year. That was 71st percentile based off of Matt Harmon's breakdown. And that's only behind comparatively to the other 2022 rookie wide receivers. Garrett Wilson, 74.5%. Chris Olave, 75.8%. You go back to the previous year that had Jamar Chase and Devontae Smith, and their success rate against man coverage in their rookie seasons. Drake London's was better than Jalen Waddle's, but it was behind Jamar Chase and Devontae Smith. So that is good company for Drake London to be in. That basically, he, based off of the last 2 years, he is a top 5 receiver after in his rookie season comparatively. And obviously we know Jamar Chase is good. We think Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave are going to be very good in this league. We saw Devontae Smith basically be the best number 2 wide receiver in the league this past year. So it's good company for Drake. And so we sat here a year ago wondering, and then when I say we, I mean me, and you guys sat here and listened to me talk about it. We wondered, is Drake London truly going to be a number 1 wide receiver? Can he win and separate in coverage? And now a year later, I feel like Drake London did as much as he humanly could do possibly to answer all of those questions. And I'm sure there's still probably a couple of people out there that are still questioning whether or not we could have taken Olave or Garrett Wilson or Jamison Williams over Drake London. But I think those people are here to nitpick. And rather than doing something constructive, like sign up for BetterHelp, those people, instead of going to therapy, they tend to like to complain about the Falcons on the internet, which, I used to indulge in that behavior quite a bit. And maybe in the future, I will continue to indulge in that behavior, or I'll just talk to a therapist. But anyway, so I think Drake London has shown that he is a number 1 wide receiver and can be the guy that we kind of quote unquote funnel the offense through in the same ways that we did with Roddy White, in the same ways that we did with Julio Jones. But the question is, who's going to be that number 2 guy, right? Because Julio Jones had Mohamed Sanu, and Roddy White had Michael Jenkins, right? So who's going to be that version of that player and that number 2 receiver? We'll talk about that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But again, want to give a shout out to my everydayers that tune in each and every week and each and every day, I'm sorry, and make this podcast their first listen. Tomorrow on the podcast, we will talk quite a bit about the tight end position. I don't necessarily know 100% ahead of the time what I'm going to say on the episode, but right now I'm leaning towards probably talking a bit about the misconnection between Pitts and Mariota, and how many yards were left on the field in terms of like the vertical passing game, and how unlocking the deep ball is also going to be critical to getting the most out of Ritter this season, as well as what Jonnu Smith and Parker Hesse and all the creative ways that Arthur Smith is going to be able to utilize those guys that will also help Desmond Ridder this upcoming season. So that will be my tentative plans for what we're going to discuss on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And of course, we thank you by subscribing to it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, right, when we talk about this number 2 wide receiver, we know that, the offense is primarily going to be funneled through Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and the running game. So what we're looking for is a complementary player, and primarily a complementary player on those third down situations, that when teams overwhelmingly play man coverage on third downs in the NFL, right, you got to win in those situations. You got to have somebody who can get open in those situations. And we saw that at the end of last season, that you can't just run the offense through Pitts and London, right? Again, that gets you to a certain place, right? But like, it's not going to get you all the way to the top of the mountain, so to speak, right? Like, you look at the last 4 games of the season, when Desmond Ridder targeted Drake London on 3rd and 4th down, the Falcons had a 3rd down, 4th down conversion rate of 58%, which is very good. Like, an elite 3rd down conversion rate in the NFL is like 45 to 50%, right? So that is an elite 3rd down conversion. So throwing the ball to Drake London on 3rd and 4th downs is obviously good for the Falcons offense, right? However, when you look at all the other 3rd and 4th down throws that Ritter had, his conversion percentage dropped to 35%, 34.8%. So when he targeted anybody else other than Drake London, that's where the Falcons had problems. In a 35% conversion rate on 3rd downs would put you at the bottom of the league. And so while you can sit there and say, oh, well, we're going to get Kyle Pitts back and that's going to pick up some of the slack, that will pick up some of the slack, but it's not going to pick up all the slack. Not to mention, we know that you cannot rely in this league on all of your star players being healthy for a full season. There's going to be a game or two here or there where that guy tweaks an ankle, or that guy misses a couple of games, or whatever the case may be. That is not a reliable strategy. It's like all of our good players won't get hurt while everybody else's good players will get hurt, or whatever the case may be. So that brings us to, who are the candidates to be that Michael Jenkins, to be that guy that can step up and still give the Falcons a reliable option on 3rd downs when Drake London, when Kyle Pitts aren't going to be the targets on those situations. And of course, you have Mack Hollins, who the Falcons signed this offseason. I think the best case scenario for Mack Hollins, if you're going to push Mack Hollins stock, is you're basically going to make the case that he is basically another version of Mohamed Sanu, right? A guy that's going to come in here with our run first attitude, bring the blocking that we know Sanu brought to the table, can be a guy that can be a reliable possession receiver over the middle of the field. We know that Mack Hollins can run the digs, the slants, the outs, the fades that are staples of this offense. And he's effective in that regard. And we saw Mack Hollins, similar to Mohamed Sanu last year with the Raiders, work as a number 2 to a high volume number 1 receiver, right? You look at Devontae Adams' target share last year at 31%, comparable to peak Julio Jones, right? While Mack Hollins had a 16% target share, which is comparable to what, Julio and Sanu, that disparity between, I think it was like 28 and 16 between Sanu and Julio back in like 2016, 2017. So I think if you're pushing, I think the ceiling for Mack Hollins is a Mohamed Sanu type of number 2, is a Michael Jenkins type of number 2. Again, Sanu, I think, was ideally more of a number 3 here in Atlanta. We'll talk about a little bit more about that later. But I think you can make the case that Mack Hollins has enough to basically be a similar type of player, but that's not necessarily a player. I can't speak for you, but that's not a player that I'm going to get particularly excited many of you longtime listeners know, I did not have a loving relationship with Mohamed Sanu. But I think the main reason why I did not love that is because I thought the Falcons paid a premium for this type of player, and they're not really doing that with Mack Hollins. Like, they're paying considerably less for Mack Hollins this year in terms of the percentage of cap that he's going to take up than what they paid for Mohamed Sanu in those first couple of years here. And it's roughly about the same as what I think is a little less than what they paid with Michael Jenkins when they gave him that contract extension back in 2008. So that's really the case. It's like, okay, if you can get similar output for as what we got from Jenkins and Sanu for, a fraction of the price, then that's a worthwhile signing. And so I think that's the selling point for Mack Hollins. For me, at least the player that I get a little bit more intrigued about, a little bit more excited about, is Scotty Miller, aka Scotty White. We saw flashes from him in Tampa Bay to be this sort of reliable slot receiver, but he was kind of buried on the depth chart behind, arguably the best receiver core in the league the last 3 years. He does have that speed to be more of a vertical threat and take the top off of the defense. He does have that speed to be a yak guy and be a creative, playmaker that they can do jet sweeps with and end arounds and reverses and all these various things to make him an integral part of the Falcons offense. They can utilize him in bunch formations. They can do a lot of diverse and creative things with Scotty Miller. And I think his speed, his ability to separate makes me a little bit more hopeful that he could emerge this year over, say, a Mack Hollins and be not only a reliable chain mover, but also a playmaker for the Falcons, because that's primarily what Olamide Zaccheaus was for the Falcons, from at least during the Marcus Mariota era. Once Desmond Ridder took over, Zaccheaus basically became a non-factor in the offense. But for the first, 13 games, Zaccheaus was the team's most explosive playmaker and their most efficient pass catcher on third downs. And so I'm hoping that we can get a similar output and maybe a little bit more consistency out of Scotty Miller with Desmond Ridder that we got from Olamide Zaccheaus last year with the Falcons. And, going back to the whole Sanu dynamic is like, to me, Scotty Miller has the potential to be the kind of the Taylor Gabriel or the Calvin Ridley that we saw when this Falcons offense was really cooking in 16 and 18. It was really Turbo and Rid that were the number twos, and Sanu was more the number three. All right. Or you could say one was a 2A and the other one was a 2B, if you're being very generous to Mohamed Sanu in those years. And that's really when the Falcons offense was operating as high. So that's kind of what I'm kind of hoping, where Hollins can be more the Sanu type and Miller can be more that 2016 Taylor Gabriel, not 2017 Taylor Gabriel, and 2018 Ridley. I won't say 2019 Ridley, because 2019 Ridley was just on a different, or at least in the second half of the season. But that's a conversation for another day. So that's what I'm hoping for Scotty Miller. But overall, it's really about patience when it comes to the Falcons' number 2 wide receiver position. I don't think the Falcons are fine at, like, they can get by this year if better options don't become available with Hollins and Miller, especially if Pitts in London are truly healthy. But I think eventually the Falcons are going to want to get more out of their offense, and therefore they can't really settle on a Jenkins Sanu type as their number 2, right? And I don't think they're going to make like a blockbuster trade like they did, to upgrade over Michael Jenkins to get Julio Jones next offseason or anything like that. But, I think in order to maximize this offense in the future, you need someone else that can win on third downs. This is why I'm a big fan of the Falcons making a move for Hunter Renfrow. He's been one of the best third down receivers in the league the last couple of years. My worry is that the Saints will wind up trading for him instead, and then we have to deal with him doing all the Hunter Renfrow things, against this defense, as opposed to us doing against their defense. So that's something to keep an eye on. But I also think this is, again, going to be a reason why we're continue to be on Corey Davis watch here on the podcast, because Corey Davis often filled this third down role for the Titans in Tennessee. In the 2 years that Arthur Smith was calling plays in Tennessee, Corey Davis had the highest conversion rate on third and fourth downs, converting about 55% of his third down. So comparable to what we saw with Drake London at the end of last year on his third and fourth down targets. So we know that Corey Davis can be a reliable chain mover in the Arthur Smith offense, and that's what makes him the ideal number 2 for this offense, because he can also do the blocking things that we expect from Mack Hollins. And while I don't think he's the deep threat that Scotty Miller is, he's probably more of a deep threat than Mack Hollins is. So he kind of, I won't say that gives you the best of both worlds, but gives you a combination of the two more so than others and can be that reliable option on third downs that we're looking for it. And again, I know some of you are like, oh, here we go again with the Corey Davis watch stuff. And it's just like, look, I know the Jets are saying all the things that they're going to keep Corey Davis, but I'll believe it when I see it. I'm a patient man. I think the Falcons are going to be patient. We just have to wait and see how this situation gets resolved with the New York Jets. And that's why I don't expect the Falcons to make any moves to upgrade their number 2 receiver. They'll just continue to bring in the JJ Arthega Whitesides and the Penny Harts and the Slade Boldens to bolster their camp competition and just basically just buy their time, right? Wait till the Jets to do the thing that they need to do, either to move on from Corey Davis or to solidify him keeping, which is basically like, I just don't buy, like, we know teams don't keep more than like 4 receivers that don't play special teams on their active roster. The Jets already have Alan Lazard, Randall Cobb, Garrett Wilson, and Mecole Hardman. Maybe they could say, well, we'll just make Mecole Hardman a return specialist and we'll make Corey Davis a regular, but they're going to be keeping who's probably going to be the 3rd or 4th receiver on their depth chart. I think probably the 4th receiver on their depth chart, and they're going to keep him at $11.2 million against the cap this year. I don't really believe it. So there's been some talk that they were going to ask Corey Davis to restructure. It's not really going to be a restructure. They're going to ask him to take a pay cut. And I could see Corey Davis basically saying, look, I have greener pastures with the Atlanta Falcons. You know, I could get a decent amount of money getting cut and signing with the Falcons versus, you know, taking this pay cut to play with the Jets and wind up being moved on from this past year. And goes back to conversation we were having earlier this offseason about like why it makes sense for the Falcons to go after Corey Davis. So eventually the Jets are either going to have to get him to take a pay cut, or they're going to have to basically, he's going to have to earn one of the top 3 spots on the depth chart, because again, I don't see them keeping him as a 4th receiver paying that type of money. And I don't see him, you know, we know Wilson's their number 1. They just signed Alan Lazard. He basically does all the same Corey Davis things. And then they sign a true slot receiver in Randall Cobb. And I just go like, I don't see Corey Davis being one of the top 3 receivers with Lazard there and with Cobb there. So we'll see. Again, we'll just have to wait and see what the Jets decide to do, if they can convince Corey Davis to take that pay cut, or they just decide to, you know, eat that contract and think that, you know, having Corey Davis as their 3rd or 4th option at his price tag gives them the best chance of winning a Super Bowl, then so be it. But we'll just have to wait and see if that happens. So I think it's about patience, right? You know, so I'm not expecting the Falcons to panic about it. They're just going to wait and see if Corey Davis becomes available. And if he does, I think they'll pounce on it. If he doesn't, then they'll just hope that, you know, Hollins or Miller can step up, or potentially, you know, some other veteran option becomes available. Because again, goes back to something I talked about on yesterday. They're still in phase 2 of this rebuild, right? And, you know, upgrading that wide receiver position may be a step that they have to take in phase 3, right? When everything has to come together for this team to make their best push moving forward, right? Which may come as early. Phase 3 may begin as early as next season, or maybe it's further down the line. But, you know, it wouldn't shock me based off of that they go through the season with Hollins and Miller as their, you know, number 2 and number 3 receivers this year. But barring one of those guys having this type of breakout season and turning into a Taylor Gabriel or turning into a better version of Mohamed Sanu, you know, I do think upgrading that number 2 wide receiver spot is going to be fairly high on their list of priorities going into the 2024 offseason. So we'll see about that. Again, I can be patient. I had to patiently wait for this. You know, I was calling out in September of 2021, hey, the Falcons need to add some speed to their offense. It took them about 8 weeks to sign Marvin Hall. So I can wait. I had to wait before. I can wait again. You know, maybe it happens in 3 months. Maybe it happens in three weeks. Maybe it's 9 months, right? Maybe it's at the trade deadline. Who knows at this point in time? I just think we got to be patient. So once again, is this the week that we trade for Corey Davis? Probably not, but we'll just have to be patient on that front. So that's it, guys, for today's episode. To summarize, I think the main takeaways from today's episode is Drake London is the Falcons' number 1 wide receiver, and he continues that legacy that Roddy White and Julio Jones, you know, have begun over the last 15 years in Atlanta. And I think Drake did as good a job as anybody could expect him to do to continue that legacy in his first year, and hopefully he continue to build off of that. And I think there's every reason to be optimistic that he can and become one of the better wide receivers in the NFL. His rapport with Desmond Ridder is going to be critical to Ritter's ability to overcome whatever his issues are when it comes to beating man coverage this upcoming season. And I also think the main takeaway is finding that secondary wide receiver option is going to be critical to this team's success. And whether that happens this year or next year, whatever, we'll just have to sort of see. But I wouldn't necessarily write off, Mack Hollins and Scotty Miller as guys that can't do it. It's just we haven't necessarily seen them do it. They have the capability of being, a Michael Jenkins / Sanu type, or a Gabriel / Ridley type, or maybe a Perlman's version of those types of secondary complementary options in this offense. And of course, I still think there's worthwhile to hold out hope for a Corey Davis type move pickup later this summer or season. So we'll just have to wait and see about that. So those are the main takeaways from today's episode. Tomorrow we'll get into the tight end position, as I said earlier, talk about, that misconnection, that lack of rapport between Pitts and Mariota, and the ways that, Ritter and him can get on the same page, particularly with the deep ball stuff. We'll talk about all the creative, fun things that I think we'll see from Jonnu Smith and Barker Hesse in this offense as it relates to some of the things that we didn't quite see from Anthony Firkser and Michael Pruitt last year in the offense. So that will be the primary topics of conversation. Maybe tomorrow we'll also talk to Marco Helms with Locked on Bama. I don't know, or maybe that's later in the week. I don't think we'll do the Matthew Bergeron breakdown before Friday, but that may be a Sunday / Monday episode. So look forward to that as well. So continue to make Locked on Falcons your first listen. We'll figure it all out, right? We're trying to figure out the offseason of how this stuff is going to go. So continue to make Locked on Falcons your first listen, guys. Subscribe to it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out all the other great shows that you can find here on the Locked on Podcast Network, where there's NBA shows, NHL shows, Major League Baseball shows, or other NFL shows. Of course, they're all free and available on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. Again, it's all part of Locked on Podcast Network, your team every